Jim, Kelvin, thank y'all so much for joining us.
Betty White was pretty.
She was, is, presently.
Is.
Come on, man.
Sorry.
So we're really excited about this conversation to have. So, Kelvin Walker,
Yes, sir.
Jim Schutze.
Yes.
So Jim, if you all don't know his story, longtime writer, carpetbagger from Detroit, and he's down here, and he comes and he joins the Dallas Times-Herald, and then also continues to write some, quite frankly, great, do a lot of great reporting with the Dallas Observer, and is just one of those guys who's kind of revered and I think feared in some other places and spaces, but I would say a Dallas institution in and of himself. And if you don't follow him on social media, you should, because he just keeps giving this stuff away for free. That you just have to at least pay a few cents to go and read. So Jim, thank you so much for being here with us today.
great
And
to
of
be
course,
here.
you gave us this piece here. Kelvin Walker. Kelvin Walker is the CEO of the Citizens Council. And first of all, I was about to say, let's just call it out. This is awkward, right? Which is fine. It's not. It's not awkward. But there's a reason why it's not, and I think that's what we're here to talk about a little bit today. Yeah. So, all that said, let's just give a little bit of context, because I didn't see everybody raise their hand who, when the question was asked, have you read The Accommodation, right? So, written in 1987. John Wiley Price, Commissioner Price, called it an essential gift, delivered almost 4 decades before Dallas was ready to receive it, which in and of itself just has so many layers, right? But also it's been called the most dangerous book in Dallas. We talked about how it went off the market, and I'll just give a little bit, and if you want to give it a little bit of color behind that too, Jim, I think that would be helpful. But the conversation I would love for us to dive into is about one of the key characters, if you will, the Citizens Council, that continues to show up throughout the book. And we'll talk about what that means, what that meant back then, but also what it means for us today. Because I think some would argue there has been an evolution in that. So Jim, how did this, first of all, check my notes, you're white.
I've had to point that out, and believe it or not, I'll tell you about that.
But why did you even write this book?
This book came along around the time of the 1984 Reagan re-election convention, which was here, and there was a line, a dogma, a kind of mantra in Dallas, in Dallas white power circles, which was that Dallas had never had any kind of racial unrest, and that the civil rights movement had sort of skipped over the city, and that everybody in Dallas was happy with that, and that black people in Dallas were happy with that. And of course, none of that was true, and none of it made sense, and it was a crazy thing to be saying, but it was repeated often and kind of aggressively. I came here in '78 from Detroit, a city that had almost burned to the ground in the late '60s because of unresolved race issues. And it just seemed dangerous and crazy to me to be propounding this idea that, in fact, not only was Dallas an exception to all of the rest of the history of the country, but that the rest of the country needed to come back to where Dallas was, needed to push the clock backwards. And in the first place, I needed to test myself. I assumed that the story that there had never been unrest here and that black people were happy with that arrangement couldn't be true. And so I had to go back and look and see what was true. And as I began that exploration, I realized, wow, the true story was night and day.
Yeah. So you were moving on a hypothesis that that story wasn't necessarily meeting the smell test, right?
Right.
And so as you started to do that and walk down that pathway, I mean, we have the book here and it's finished format. But I'm interested in your discovery along that journey. What did you learn along the way? What surprised you? And how did that then end up manifest in how you decided to tell the story?
I was working on this at night at the Dallas Public Library. I'm a journalist, not a historian. And so I was looking at Dallas newspapers on microfiche from the 50s, which were very interesting. But I was working in the Dallas and Texas collection at the Dallas Public Library, which is a great archive. And a couple of the librarians there, and there were also a couple of real historians working on their own books, and they said, well, I told them what I was doing, and they said, you're just not going back far enough. You're taking too shallow a bite. You've got to understand the history of slavery in Texas. And I didn't get that at all. The story I'd always gotten that was kind of universally repeated was that slavery here was a milder thing than it was in the Old South.
Yeah, it's slavery light.
Yeah, right, right, yeah. As if, good point, as if there could be a milder form.
Absolutely.
But
right, diet slavery.
But one historian turned me on to these things that I got the Library of Congress to ship down here, which were the reports of the agents of the Freedmen's Bureau from this area to Washington about what was going on after the Civil War. And it was horrendous. It was this organized campaign of brutal racial terror. And this was something that was going on throughout the former Confederacy. Dallas wasn't an exception to the rule, but here, and these guys showed me how to compare these reports to the reports from other parts of the South. Here it was tangibly more brutal and organized and relentless. And so then all of a sudden you have the roots of the story, and you can come forward into a time in the 20th century if I looked at it cold as a guy from Detroit, I would say, well, why were black people in Dallas so much more conservative in their approach to these issues? When you look at it in the context of the early history, you realize, oh man, this was a more dangerous place. And so conservative was simply a strategic necessity.
Yeah, to keep living.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of the thing, right? That wasn't part of that narrative back during that time when we were talking about how the civil rights movement skipped through Dallas. But enter the Citizens Council, at least the Citizens Council back then. And so, Kelvin, this is one of the things that I would love, as we get into a little bit of what that meant for our history, I'd love to just learn a little bit more about your story. Share, if you will. Some people might be familiar with you. I certainly am and have been for a long time, have a lot of respect for who you are, what you've been, very successful business leader himself, and in his own right, respected across the country, in fact. So when I saw the announcement that Kelvin Walker is the next CEO of the Dallas Citizens Council, I was like, either Kelvin has changed or the Citizens Council is changing. And I'm pretty sure Kelvin ain't changed because I've talked to him since then. So go ahead, Kelvin, if you could, just tell a little bit about your own story, man, your own background.
Oh, sure. Thank you for having me. And I'm always nervous to be by Jim in case I say the wrong thing. No.
We only have 2 cameras, and yeah, no.
Well, first with me, I've been here since 1999. I moved here 22 years ago with my lovely wife, Celia, who's recording. I hope you in the back, and Fort Worth girl. And I moved here to work in private equity. I spent my career before that, after graduating from Morehouse in banking and investment banking. But I grew up in a small town in what you would have called in the late 60s, early 70s, the segregated South. My parents were students in Alabama during the bus boycott, so that sort of informed how we thought about civil rights and growth and opportunity, and we knew education was always our way out and a way to make sure you created some level of independence. And they were educators, I chose to go into the business world and banking, and then ultimately private equity here, working with Tom Hicks, and then ultimately working with Bob Johnson out of DC, but here in Dallas. And it got to a point that I was just traveling too much and thought wanted to find another opportunity to have deeper roots. I had been reeled in by Jennifer Sampson into the United Way Mafia to be on the board. I'm back on the board again for the second time around. I think you can just never get out once you get with the United Way. That's right. and involved in various other nonprofits, the Methodist Health System and others. And so in some ways, when I got the call about the opportunity for the Citizens Council, I saw as a way to marry my not-for-profit work with also my private sector knowledge of how we might do and think differently about Dallas. And thankfully, I joined the year after we had decided to stop endorsing candidates, because frankly, I think the Citizens Council wasn't very good at it. I mean, if you keep supporting the candidates who lose, that really doesn't help the business interests in the first place. So I think we needed to get to a point, as I joined, to say, we don't care who wins the elected offices, let's care about our priorities, which are really focused on, thanks to our former chair, who was our first African-American serving chair, Fred Perpall, focusing on inclusive growth. We've had this great prosperity in North Texas, but we only have to take one step south of I-30 and realize while opportunity hasn't been distributed evenly, even though we know talent is distributed evenly. So I saw the opportunity to bring the business community more proximate to opportunities and do it in a way where it would be our opportunity to work with philanthropy and the public sector to execute and activate around change and not just talk and admire problems.
Thank you, Kelvin. And you know, in the long tradition of Kelvin Walker, he says the quiet part loud. And so your point about picking, candidates, right? Mm-hmm. Picking mayors. If you read the accommodation, you'll recognize that is absolutely what the Citizens Council did for a long, long time.
Absolutely.
And you said they kept losing here recently. And so, what, if you can share, what led to the decision for them to take a different posture in how the Citizens Council shows up? Because I'm interested in knowing what is the point of a Citizens Council today.
Sure.
I think it's a fair question for the world to ask. Go ahead.
I think, you got to go back to the very beginnings in 1937 when it was more about the centennial celebration and more about, at the time, businessmen, and I want to say clearly businessmen, and let me give a shout out to our Vice President of Public Affairs, Sarah Jackson, who was mad that it's only men on the panel, but that's a discussion for another day. I didn't do that. But the notion was bringing businessmen together to make things different or better in Dallas. Everything from the highways to really using public policy, but the strength of businessmen to do that. Now, in terms of the notion of supporting candidates, if you go back to 1931, that's the point at which Dallas started having at-large districts. And so we were in a town that's run by business people. And that's when we moved to the council manager form of government in 1931, which means the city manager is the CEO and the mayor is elected, but not the CEO of the city. And so for years, as you read the accommodation, you know that the Citizens Council just would say, here are 14 people we want to win, and that slate just won. I think over the years, as we moved to single-member districts, and as this mysterious organization, and we said, we've got to get more transparency. If you want to solve problems, people have to know who are there to solve problems, and they have to know who they can trust to interact with.
Trust is a big part of it. Go ahead, Joe.
See, he's not good for my act. Yeah. One of the difficult sort of conundrums about the book coming back out is the question, have things changed or not? And I think everybody here is probably aware that there are zip codes in Dallas where things have tragically not changed at all. And that's something that weighs heavily on our conscience as a city, but it also weighs heavily on our future. But other things have changed dramatically. And the first time I met Kelvin, I was secretly trying not to go like this all the time and act too astonished. But I remembered my first encounter with the Citizens Council after the book came out. My point is going to be that what's really changed, absolutely, has been a change in white people, black people in southern Dallas all knew this story already. There was no news in my book there. They knew it in greater detail than I reported. But the change since then in white folks is really astonishing, and I think it's illustrated no more dramatically than in the Citizens Council. After the book came out, my editor came to me and said, "You have been called before the Citizens Council." And I said, "What does that mean?" And
We had him come to our secret location.
he said, "Schutz, just shut up and be there at 1 p.m." So I went, and there was this room that was like a little auditorium. It was in a high-rise downtown, and I had to, maybe I'm making this up in memory, but I feel like I sat in a little kid chair, and these guys, there were 4 guys on sort of a dais, and we talked for a little while, and then they said, "Mr. Schutz, what do black people want?" And I said, "Look, these are complicated times, and we can't judge each other by appearance anymore, but you guys know I'm white, right?" And they said, "Yes, we know that, And I said, "Well, you got to invite someone black here to ask that question."
This is earth-shattering.
I said, "I'm not the right one for this question." So I have to admit, when Kelvin and I first met and started talking, I thought, okay, Schutz, you got to bag up all that old stuff about what the Citizens Council is. I can still disagree with them on individual projects and stuff and infrastructure issues and things like that, but culturally, we're talking about a dramatic transformation, and it involves, I just know the guys, it involves a lot of powerful old white guys opening up. I think there was a process. I think the mayoral tenure of Ron Kirk was a big, big watershed. But what happened was that white leadership has simply sort of stepped off the white, what do you call it, the white internment camp and into a more diverse world.
So let's talk a little bit about the Dallas stories, right? And Will said we are the stories that we tell, right? There's a couple of stories out there about Dallas, city of Dallas. One is that we have big ideas, we do big things, we're a can-do city, and we can make it happen, right? The ball materialized out of just will, and Reunion Tower is just built of sheer gumption, right?
Right.
And then there's another story, and there's a story that is less written about, doesn't appear, on the things that we're super proud of, and it's called the Dallas Way, right? And so I'm going to use, I don't typically do that here, but I am going to read an excerpt here that I think kind of summarizes some of what some would say the Dallas Way is, that I think we need to interrogate ourselves and look at, okay, what do you do with that now? So this is from a part of the accommodation. Spoiler alert, I'm not actually going to read what actually happens from this, but it encapsulates what we're talking about here. So this was about Fair Park. There were houses that were due to be, honestly, taken away from some of the residents who were living down in South Dallas Fair Park, right? So picking up in the middle of the story, Eric Johnson is the co-founder and president of Texas Instruments. For any of you all who've been blessed with a calculator that you lost and then had to repurchase, because that's what public education said you had to do, got that from here. Eric Johnson and so many more things, right? T.I. is a fantastic contributor to the city of Dallas, certainly philanthropy-wise and definitely in employment. He was also the mayor of Dallas. That was just how it was in Dallas, how it always had been. That was especially how it was with Mr. Eric Johnson. Dallas was an ordered city. Everything had its order, and the order needed to be respected. Even the white people only got ahead by respecting the order, by working their ways up slowly through the labyrinth of committees and commissions, charities, and volunteer activities until the men at the top finally smiled upon them. You can insert in their parentheses, white men at the top finally smiled upon them. So had the black community been given its order, its system of rank and caste, centered on the ministerial alliance, and through the ministerial alliance drawing its power from the Citizens Council, from the oligarchy itself, demanding that the mayor stoop to meet with black servants, that he bend to their will, was demanding that the entire logic of the city turn itself inside out. So I'll let you read the book to figure out what happened after that part, but that's kind of the thing, right? That's the unwritten story that I think Dallas has to contend with. We got a lot of new people coming in from the West. We got a lot of people coming in from the East. We got a lot of people coming in from all over the world. But there are some who would argue that that still exists in some iteration, version, form, fashion. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on, one, do you feel like that's true? Two, is it evolving? Has it evolved to something different? And what should it be if we're framing ourselves against what was and what has been part of the Dallas story that's been untold? Either one.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I think we have to realize the differences in political structure too. I hear so often, why isn't Dallas more like Atlanta? Why isn't it more like this other city or some other city? But political activism would take a different form here, because it wasn't, if you think about 1972, 73, when Maynard Jackson becomes mayor, he became mayor at a time when he was actually the CEO, the person to run the city. And so people galvanizing to say we want a different path and a different way meant they could have a person who could say, well, look, if 25% to 40% of these contracts don't go to black and brown contractors, we're not going to build the airport. He had the ability to stop, to say that's going to happen. In Dallas, we operate in a very different system, because it's really the city manager that would be vested with that kind of power. And if you roll the clock back, so often during the civil rights struggle, even the activism would have been hard to overcome the notion of the not having single member districts. And so I think that the Dallas way, you had businessmen who decided who would run the business of Dallas. So the city manager, as well as most times it was a businessman, a former CEO or current CEO, who would be the mayor of Dallas. And so, and again, as an aside, Dallas exists almost because we're here for business. There are no mountains here. There's no lake. There's no river. Well, we got the Trinity River, but we're not near the ocean. So it's been more about the business of the city. And I think the Dallas way that existed then, I'm sure some of that exists here and everywhere else, where strong business interests will try to put their thumb on the scale to change outcomes. I think we have less of that because we have single member districts, but I think the other part of it is there is more engagement as well.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
But I know you, Byron. That didn't satisfy your answer. What did I miss?
No, they didn't. I want the people to hear whatever you believe is the case here. No, thank you. And I'm serious about that, Kelvin. Go ahead.
Certainly, Kelvin's put his finger on a very important theme, which is money. And I always thought it was interesting when I was working on the book. Alex Bickley, who was then CEO of the Citizens Council, told me, he always called me Mr. Schultz. He said, Mr. Schultz, we've never accepted federal money here. And so what I found as soon as I got back into the 50s was that the whole river in downtown was rebuilt with federal money. Huge grants after World War II, as were cities everywhere. It was so-called slum clearance money, it was flood control money, it was all kinds of money, but a lot of it. Which spawned huge public works contracts. And that's the prize. I don't think that the Citizens Council was sitting on top of everything and running everything in order to enforce a philosophy on the city. That was sort of a corollary of it. But what the Citizens Council was concerned with was the money and the access to these huge contracts. And that is as true today, if you look at our huge projects, as it ever was. On the surface, the advent of single-member districts and the rise of minority power, which is community power. I mean, white folks in communities get more power from community power too, but but that has given rise to a system of sharing that wasn't in place before, but it's pretty imperfect. And the mechanism that hides it is the city manager system. We can have I think we have a great city manager now. And I have huge respect for the professionalism of the staff. But that construction of things is so different from what you're talking about with Maynard Jackson. I remember talking to Fred Kelleher when he was CEO of Southwest Airlines, and he knew I was from Detroit. He said, "Man, I like that mayor in Detroit, Coleman Young. Now, there's a great mayor." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you do a deal with that son of a bitch, and you got a deal." and I thought, yeah, that's called a very different structure of government, which you guys don't want here. And I think we are still hobbled by that, by the fact that the mayor isn't the mayor.
The mayor here functions a lot like the chairman of the board, right? And then you have the CEO of the organization or the entity, who is the city manager. Honestly, I grew up here, and I didn't know that until I was an adult. And so, it kind of brings me to another place where I think I would love for us to spend a little bit of time. So we've talked about the accommodation. We've talked about our history. I do encourage you all, wherever you can, get a copy of this book. Please read it. There's another great book, White Metropolis, that's out as well. It covers a lot of the same stories. We are a city that has a lot going for it. Even in spite of, like you said, not being on top of anything that was valuable, except for there was a lot of cotton around too, right? So we talked about that part as well. But if we are going to move forward, if we're going to become the kind of city where 15% of the revenue tax-wise doesn't come from 60% of the landmass that's south of the Trinity, if we're going to become a more balanced and inclusive city, what does it look like? What is the role that the Citizens Council should take? And my question also is, what is its role in, I think, accounting for or reckoning for its past as well, right? Because you can't really flip a switch and say, hey, trust me. You got to earn that back. Sure. Given the reality of what we also know has happened and has occurred, how does the Citizens Council show up in helping the city become, I think, the best version and most inclusive version of itself?
How much time do you have here?
About 15.
I think there's so many ways I want to go with that question. First, I want to say opportunity in Dallas. One of the things the business community can do, and the Citizens Council as a voice of the business community, one of the voices in the business community, not the only one, we've got to advocate first for the right things to come to Dallas. And I think we've done a lot of that with the DISD bond election, with the Dallas College bond election. We've got tremendous new construction soon coming out of UT Southwestern. But the challenge in doing that is, or the opportunity in doing that is to say, hey, let's not do it the way we've always done it. There's been a history of what I've seen personally is we hold up one or two minority contractors and hold them up here to the sky and say, we're going to give this person all this great business, and there are all these great stories about it. But we've not created a full ecosystem of black and brown businesses of scale. And we've got billions of dollars of public works projects, $2 billion from Dallas College, another $2 or $3 billion from DISD. You've got all the transportation work that's going on. UNT Dallas continues to build. We can create from that with the largesse of pressure from the business community, i.e. the Citizens Council, to say, look, let's make sure 25, 30, 40%, whatever the right number is, to scale minority businesses in the process of this construction, both in the construction and the services. And then you begin to say, guess what? a lot of those businesses are located south of 30. You can begin to move the real economic imbalance of 85-15 that way. And then beyond that, I think, well, first of all, I think that's the way to begin to earn trust in the community, by continuing to show up and talk about that. Second is something that we're working on that hasn't quite come to fruition, I'm working on with Jennifer, is to really speak out more specifically about racial equity. We're developing a racial equity coalition with the Chamber and the United Way, and we will be partnering with many organizations who've been doing the work forever. It just happens that we may be more resourced in a way that we can be partners. And we got to be very specific to say, Dallas, there has been racism in Dallas in the past and still today. But what we have to do to change that is by providing a wider lane of economic opportunity and a wider lane of admission of the historical challenges and past that have been in some ways intentional. And I think that's the way that we both earn our trust and continue to do the work. Because as I tell Sarah all the time, I say, I can't go on an apology tour for what happened in 1935 or 40, but I acknowledge that it happened. I think that what we have to do in a forward-looking way is say, how do we change the real economics? And really give people a chance. And I think the challenge is, and I'll say this, because you're giving me the stop, look.
No. Keep going. This is good.
We have to give women and minority entrepreneurs a chance to get an opportunity and fail, and not say, you know what, we hired a Hispanic contractor one time, we can't do this again. There are like 90 of them in town. Yeah. So we have to level the playing field for both success and failure, and in doing so, we create a broader playing field, and guess what? You will start to see these neighborhoods populate with better services and with more intentionality. And here's my last thing, and Jennifer knows I'm going to say this. We need the entire business community to focus on getting more grocery stores south of I-30. We need that to happen. And I work on it virtually every day because Councilman Atkins calls me every day about it. But those are the kind of things, that's where the Citizens Council has to show up more beyond just saying, oh, here's $10,000, we support the effort. We've got to be there in person, and we've got to bring the largesse of all of our businesses more proximate to the challenges.
Appreciate you, Kelvin. Jim.
Everything Kelvin says brings to mind something that's been on my mind because of the republishing of this book at a time when there's all of this controversy over so-called critical race theory, which isn't about, I mean, who even knows what critical race theory is? It's an academic pursuit that none of us really understands. But it's the debate over critical race theory is about the truth about our history. And there's this attempt to tell people that you are not allowed to discuss our history. You are not allowed to discuss the truth of what went on here forever and ever. You and I talked about this the other day. To me, it reminds me of a guy standing on his front porch saying, I did not steal that TV set in my house. Stop saying I stole it. It did not come off the dock at Best Buy at 10 o'clock last night. So don't bring that up again. I mean, everything about the critical race theory debate, it just makes people sound guilty and refusing to engage reality. And what I hear you saying is that we engage reality as a way to simply move forward, to get it off the, to get it out of the way, not to make it disappear, but to acknowledge it and deal with it. And the fact that you're saying it is just, again, such a dramatic change from what I found when I came here in '78.
Yeah, the only reason why the Accommodation would be a dangerous book is if we don't want things to change.
Right.
Right? But if we want things to change, then you have to confront the history. You have to deal with the history in Dallas of racial violence, of racial terrorism, of also the intentional economic barriers that were established for people of color. And we'll end this with the kind of the final reflection from you, Jim. You know, the demographics of our city have changed even since 1987 when you wrote this, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you were to say, okay, what else has changed since you have gone through, written that, but You know, you keep living, you see things happening. If you had to add an addendum, or if there was a new The Accommodation Part 2 that's written, what would be featured stories, lenses, and perspectives that would be there? And would you even be the one to write it?
No, I would not. Listen, one of the first questions I have gotten in talking about the republishing of the book, and it's always asked very politely, it's why are we listening to an old white man about this? And I always want to say, that's a great question. Can I please go home? We absolutely need a new book by somebody who doesn't look like me. There's a huge hole in the book in that it doesn't even deal with the Hispanic presence in the city, which is now a majority. And of course, it does. There's another huge reality it doesn't deal with because it hadn't happened yet, but that's this enormous growth of suburban new world all around us that's very diverse and energetic and wants to come back into the city. I think that's one of the reasons the book has come back. It's a lot of young people who've come into the city, looked around and said, wait a minute, they didn't tell us about this in American history class. Why does the city look like this? Why does it have this line across the middle? So those are two things that a new book would need to deal with. One is the Hispanic presence in the city and what it means and what its role has been and will be. And the other is going to be the influence of the suburbs coming back into the city, which means lots of new, younger people who've grown up in much more diversity than exists in the city.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for that reflection. Thank you all so much for your time. I would say that we are in a very unique time where this conversation is critical. It is more important now that we know our history and face our history than it's ever been before, because I would say that there are forces out there that would seek for us to not talk about this, that would prefer that it is forgotten, and if we do that, then we do so at our own peril. So thank you so much, Kelvin. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you.